In the TV series Downton Abbey and Jeeves and Wooster, the servants look quite happy. But in fact, the life of servants in Victorian England was very different from the one we're used to seeing on the screen. So, let's live one day together with the servants of a large English house and find out how it really was. Why all the maids were called Abigail, and what their bedroom looked like. What jobs were actually the hottest ones, and what clothes maids were not allowed to wear. Why was Jeeves against Wooster's marriage, and did the servants have a private life? Servants in England didn't just free the mistress of the house from cleaning and cooking. They were a symbol of well-being and status. Even the poorest families tried to hire at least one maid who had to cook and do the cleaning. Even the workers and the servants themselves had servants. No wonder this period was called the Century of Servants. They replaced the modern household appliances. Doctors, lawyers, engineers kept at least 3 servants. Well, in rich aristocratic houses there were hundreds of them. For example, at the end of the 19th century, the 6th Duke of Portland kept 320 male and female servants. Look at the house of Arthur Munby, a barrister and poet, but not famous one. The servants wake up at 5. You may ask, what is this strange structure? Yes, that is how the maid's bedroom looked like to save on heating. By 6 a.m., while the owner is still asleep, all the servants are already on their feet, and by candlelight they start walking. Molly, the dishwasher, is the first who starts her duties. She must heat the stove, boil water for tea, clean the kitchen and scratch the floor with sand. Both maids in this house hurriedly get into uncomfortable corsets and pull on long pantaloons. Both of them are called Abigail. The thing is that the servants had no right to be called by their own names. It didn't matter how many maids worked in the house, the owners could call any of them Emma or Abigail. Servants of a higher rank, like a butler or a personal maid, were called exclusively by their last name, as in the Woodhouse books where Bertie Wooster calls his valet Jeeves, although his name is Reginald. The real name of one of the maids in this house is Hannah Cullwick. She has been working as a maid since she was 8 years old. During her long career, she has been a junior maid, a scullery maid, a cook, cook's assistant, and head housekeeper. But the most interesting thing is that all this time she kept a detailed diary. This is how she describes her typical morning. I opened the shutters and lit the kitchen hearth, shook out my sooty clothes over the garbage pit and poured the ashes there, swept the floor and dusted the rooms and the hall, threw firewood into the furnace and cooked breakfast, cleaned 2 pairs of boots, made the bed and poured out the slops, cleaned up after breakfast, washed the dishes, polished knives and cooked dinner, cleaned and tidied up the kitchen. As in English society in general, there was a rigid hierarchy in the world under the stairs. At the highest level were teachers and governesses, who, however, were rarely counted among the servants. Then upper-level servants, headed by a butler. He was certainly above all physical labor. The next in the hierarchy was a personal valet, like the famous Jeeves. By the way, the services of a valet were used by single men. Is that why Jeeves drove away potential brides from his master, Bertie Wooster, so zealously? After all, marriage would mean their inevitable separation. The working day of the servants in Victorian England wasn't like the weekdays of serial servants at all. It was heavy and long, about 17 hours. The rush season came between mid-May and mid-August, It was a time of entertainment, dinners, receptions and balls, during which parents were looking for a desirable alliance for their daughters. For the servants, this season was a real nightmare. They went to bed late after midnight, only with the departure of the last guests, and they had to wake up at the usual time at 5 a.m. But perhaps the most difficult thing for the servants was to be around people constantly, people who at the most do not notice you. In her diaries, the famous writer Virginia Woolf describes household servants almost with hatred and how difficult it is for her to keep patience with them. In general, the servants were annoying like kitchen flies. Humiliation was a constant companion of a servant. In one book of that time, there were instructions describing how servants should be humiliated in the presence of a child, for the greater benefit of both, the child and the servants. British historian Pamela Cox, whose great-grandfather was also a servant, writes that the life of real servants was far from that coziness which we see in modern television dramas. Most of them were the only servant in an average townhouse of a very poor family. These people were doomed to a lonely vegetating in dark and damp basements. Unlike the servants of large and noble houses, they did all the work alone. Their salary was less, and they were deprived of communication with colleagues. Instead of cheerful dinner in the company of other servants, they lived and ate alone, in dark basement kitchens. A British historian proves that her ancestors had no free time at all, like servants in some TV series. Employees of noble houses lived a little better, but nevertheless, without exception, all of them worked from 5 in the morning to 10 at night for very little salary. But let's go back to our house. 15 minutes past 8, the servants gather in the kitchen for breakfast. The cook gives them oatmeal porridge, tea and bread and butter. The servants' diet depended on the family's income and generosity of the owners. In some houses, the servants' lunch included cold poultry, vegetables, ham. In other houses, they were kept half-starved. Hannah Cullwick was tall and well-built, but most important were her large, very strong and muscly arms. She just loved to measure them in all dimensions. From work they turned red, roughened, there was dirt clogged under the nails, but in the future her hands would play a key role in her fate. The thing is that all this time she has been married. It is a secret marriage with her master, Arthur Momby, who hides this fact from family and friends, that her huge, reddened hands attracted him. He was generally attracted to commoners. In private, they behaved like ordinary husband and wife, but when guests came, Hannah returned to the role of a maid again, and didn't idle her time away all day. But as we can see, she worked hard. Well, meanwhile, Hannah Cullwick took 2 chickens to Mrs. Brewer's and brought a note from her, baked a fruit pie, plucked and gutted 2 ducks, fried them, washed the stairs and tiles, kneeling, covered the iron grid at the house entrance with graphite, washed the outdoor tiles, also on her knees, washed the clothes in the pantry, cleaned the pantry on her knees and scrubbed the tables, polished the tiles around the house and wiped the window sills. Invisibility was the main requirement for the servants. They shouldn't catch the eyes of the owners, and even more, they were not allowed to speak. The owners didn't want to hear their voices ever. The Victorian house was built to accommodate 2 different classes of society under one roof, so that they wouldn't never see each other. There was installed a system of rings to call the servants. They had to sleep in the attic and work in the basement. When gas and electricity became widely used in houses, they were rarely put in the attic. According to the owners, it was an unacceptable waste. The maids went to bed by candlelight, and on a cold winter morning they had to break frozen water in a jug to wash well. They were surrounded by grey walls, bare floors, lumpy mattresses, darkened mirrors, and cracked sinks. But the real torture for servants were stairs, because they had to rush up and down it all day, carrying heavy buckets of coal or hot water for a bath. The position of the servants was ambivalent. On the one hand, they were part of the family, and they knew all the secrets. On the other, they were still completely strangers, while being privy to other people's secrets. This is what the ideal maid of those years looked like. Naive but devoted, she had no mouth and ears, not to eavesdrop on the master's conversation, and even more, not to retell them to her friends, because this was servants' favorite hobby. Impeccable recommendations from previous owners were required to apply for a good vacancy, of course. But not every owner could hire a good servant, because employers also needed recommendations of their own. Servants also had blacklists, and the bad employer's fame scattered instantly. In the series about Jeeves and Wooster, Woodhouse often mentions a similar list compiled by members of the Juniors Ganymede Club, which Jeeves belonged to. Everyone joining this club was obliged to tell everything they knew about their masters. Fascinating reading was compiled from this information, especially for those who was thinking about applying for a new job. The servants couldn't have any private life. The maids were often unmarried and had no children. They could be fired immediately for communicating with the man. If the maid got married, she was also fired. The maids who suffered from master's harassment were also obliged to remain silent. But what work did the servants themselves consider the hardest one? In the first place was laundry. Laundresses were treated with contempt. Even though without running water and modern detergents, washing turned into a real hell, especially considering how much they had washed. Clothes were soaked in urine or dilute solution of chicken manure. These liquids have a bleaching effect. Since then, there were many contagious diseases such as scarlet fever. They didn't trust outsiders with washing. Even in the 20th century, many wealthy Londoners sent laundry by train to their country estates every week, so it could be washed by people they trust. In the second place is the polishing of endless parquet floors. The corridors in old manors stretched for almost a mile. They had to be polished by hand, kneeling. As a rule, this was delegated to the youngest maid, a teenage girl. And now imagine, to avoid master's eyes, she got up before daylight, took a candle and on her knees scrubbed and rubbed every centimeter of the floors of all the damp, unheated corridors of huge houses, because in England even bedrooms were not heated. The disease that the poor girls received was called the housemaid's knee, prepatellar bursitis, sometimes with displacement. Another unloved activity was cleaning fireplaces until the wrists hurt. The fireplaces were heated with coal, which gave not only carbon deposits, but also greasy soot. Of course, it wasn't male servants' job. Mostly the same poor maids did it. Well, in the end of the most difficult activities list is cleaning the steps with chalk. Snow-white house steps were the main priority for an Englishwoman of the 19th century, in England with its eternal dampness and slush. The maids were obliged to run out into the dank street during the day and rub the steps with chalk at any time of the year. But let's go back to our Hannah. The friends who visited Mom's apartment didn't even realize that the modest maid who takes their hats was actually Mrs. Moreover, Hannah kept her maiden name and even insisted that Arthur continue to pay her salary. It seems that she was a practical girl. The husband, of course, tried to dress her up and make her a lady, but she was uncomfortable in expensive outfits. She wrote, "I can work for my own pleasure, go away and come back whenever I want. I have been wandering around London for so many years, and no one said a bad word to me, if I dress simply and do not interfere with other people's affairs." Maids had no right to look attractive, and lower-level maids were forbidden even to think about such excesses as silks, feathers, earrings, flowers. A maid who bought silk stockings for herself could be fired. The target of ridicule was often the maids who got the master's outfits and who could spend all their salary on a fashionable dress. When a maid entered the service, she usually had 3 dresses in a tin chest, an indispensable attribute of a maid. A simple dress that was worn in the morning, a black dress with a white cap and an apron, which was worn during the day, and a going-out dress. All dresses had to be long. Even if the girl was mopping the floor, she had to cover her ankles. The maids had no right to resist the harassment of the owner openly. The housekeeper monitored the morality in the house. Having seen such a scene with a poker face, they could only find an urgent task for a girl in another part of the house, and if the housekeeper didn't prevent it in time, the girl was dealing with all the consequences by herself, and all the blame was on her. The housekeeper also had to make sure that the maids didn't try to make up or comb their hair fashionably, and that they didn't talk to young people at the back porch. Until the beginning of the 19th century, servants were not supposed to have days off. It was believed that when entering service, a person understood that from now every minute of their time belongs to the owners. It was also considered indecent if relatives or friends, and especially friends of the opposite sex, came to visit the servants. Well, how much did they earn doing such a wonderful job? In the middle of the 19th century, a mid-level maid earned an average of £6–8 a year, plus extra money for tea, sugar, and beer. The maid who served directly to the mistress received more than £12–15 a year. Valet got £25–50. Okay, well, what could £1 buy? 6 shirts or 6 bottles of champagne? Not a lot. To understand how much the servants earned, compare. At the end of the 19th century, a bank manager received £600 a year. A primary school teacher assistant earned £200, and a maid got 12. In addition to salaries, servants traditionally received gifts for Christmas and tips from guests. The owner even informed when hiring how often they have visits, so that a potential candidate could count tips. When the guests left, all the servants lined up in 2 rows, and the guest tipped depending on his social status. For poor people who stayed at their rich relatives with many servants, tipping was a real nightmare. They even declined an invitation to visit out, for fear of looking poor or going broke. Well, our Hannah brought tea to the master, washed the toilet, the corridor and floor and the pantry on her knees, washed the dog and cleaned the sinks. She wrote in her diary, "I cooked dinner and left it in the kitchen for Ren to take it. I myself was too dirty and too tired to go upstairs, took a bath and went to bed." Amazingly, this is a very ordinary maid's day, except for one detail. Hannah took a bath. Her notes mostly end with a tired and hopeless "went to bed dirty." But the most interesting thing is that 4 years later, after Mombi and Hannah made their marriage official at the initiative of Mr. Mombi, her patience came to an end. She suddenly slammed the door, left and started working for another master. Soon the couple made up, and Mr. Monday often visited Hannah at her new workplace. However, they no longer attempt to live together, although they remain good friends until their death. Do like and subscribe if you enjoyed this story. Oh, and click on the bell so you get notified when the new episode comes out.